last session of this conference, and we have four very good papers to be presented, which are supposed to be the happy ending of this conference, because it will be about the attitude or the position of GCC countries regarding the Arab Spring events. We have four speakers. Dr. Abdulwahab al-Qassab, who is a researcher in the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, who worked in the Iraqi Armed Forces for the period 1966 to 1991. He was retired with the grade or rank of Brigadier General, and now he's a researcher in Arab Center for Research, and he was also a researcher in the University of Baghdad. He obtained his PhD degree from the United States of America. We have also Mr. Abdul Naser al-Muwadea from Yemen, who is a political researcher who focuses on Yemeni affairs, and he is also advisor and trainer in different topics such as election campaigns, negotiations, election laws, and he has many publications and articles about democracy, the government, and reforms in the. And we have Mr. Abdullah from Talaa, who is a researcher and the Arab Center for Research and Policy, has a master's degree in political science. And last but not least, we have Mr. Birol Baskan, who is an assistant professor in the Georgetown University, Qatar, and he has published a number of periodicals such as Arab Studies, Politics, and I don't need to read all this. He has obtained his PhD in political science from the University of Northwestern in 2006. As is the custom, we give 15 minutes to each speaker, and we begin with Dr. Abdul Naser al-Muwadea. You have 15 minutes. Thank you. I will go directly into review of my paper, which is under the title of the Yemen and the Gulf, this blood scenarios, isolation and penetration scenarios. I will review this paper by giving you its outcomes or results, and you can read the full paper later on. The main hypothesis of this paper is that Yemen does not have objective elements or factors to be a stable or prosperous country throughout history, and not at the present moment. The model for Yemen throughout its history, it has never had a central government, a stable central government during its history. The first central government that ruled over Yemen was in 1990, and right now this state and this government are facing chaos. The objective factors that lead to the instability of Yemen, which is worst, lack of resources, the climate, and the geographic position, which isolates Yemen from other countries and makes it vulnerable to external interventions. Throughout 50 years, Yemen depended on the exterior for its survival, whether before the division, the unity of the country. The Jews depended on the Soviets, the North depended on the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia. The revolution that took place in Yemen in 2011 had weakened the fragile regime or authority of Yemen and made it a failed state as known by everybody. The fate or destiny of Yemen is that only that was to avoid being another Somalia. Uh, the, we want to be at least at the level of Lebanon or between Somalia and Lebanon. That's the situation in Yemen is just the contrary of the situation of the Gulf states. I'll give you some economic indicators that reveal both situations. The GDP of Yemen is about $50 billion, whereas that of GCC countries are $1,600 billion. That's why we only have 3% of their. And this is close to the GPD of Bahrain, which is the smallest country in the Gulf. Yemen produces 140,000 barrels per day compared to 16 million barrels by the GCC countries. That's to say, what's produced by Yemen in 1 year is produced by the GCC countries in 3 days. The population is 20 million, which is more than the population of the GCC countries, which is 24 million. Yemen produces electricity 1,200 megawatts and have an aluminum plant in the Emirates produces 3 times more than Yemen produces. In Yemen, a child out of 3 newborn children, 11 newborn children dies, while as 1 out of 100 dies in Oman, which is a neighboring country to Yemen. All these differences indicate that Yemen is in a complete contradictory situation compared to the Gulf. Yemen's position and its ecosystem is only limited to the GCC countries, and its political situation and makes it unwelcome to be included in the GCC countries. What we wish in the Yemen is to be part of the GCC countries to benefit from their economic welfare, while as the Gulf looks into Yemen as a security problem to be avoided and isolated. But the Gulf states cannot completely ignore Yemen or isolate it, but it also would not integrate it. That's why Yemen is a problem for the GCC countries, at least. These are the main aspects of the problem. As Yemen is now living a chaotic situation and which will continue for so at least in the near future, the implications of this unstable station will be reflected or have its implications on the GCC countries. The reflection of these problems on the GCC countries are put into 3 different possible scenarios. These are not forecasts, but only scenarios. One is security breakthroughs, and I have divided into 3 kinds of security breakthrough. Qualitative ones that say there might be some terrorist operations in some GCC countries against some strategic centers in them, or the assassination of one of the first-rank politicians. Especially that this is possible, especially that the present chaotic situation and the non-state situation in Yemen would encourage and activate the terrorists, especially al-Qaeda, which is not a local organization, it is a regional. It calls itself the al-Qaeda organization in the peninsula, that includes the Gulf states and Yemen. There is also the attrition security break. That is to say, Yemen might be used by terrorists to go into Saudi Arabia through Yemen, and then there's or to Oman. And there is also some cases of breaking through security aspects or the country, at least on the borders between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And of course, these crises are always there, and as a result of this unstable situation in Yemen. There's a big breach, security breach also, that after the experience of ICL and al-Qaeda doesn't seem to be impossible. And maybe a group of these terrorists might go through the borders through Yemen. Oman is a bit further apart from the population density regions. And that's why the best possibility, or the strongest possibility that any breach of the borders of Saudi Arabia might be through Yemen. This could be by the Yemen or by some international forces. And there's also the possibility of occupation of territories in these regions and other breaches that will change the structure of these states. As for the scenarios of the reaction of the GCC countries' scenarios, the first scenario that's expected is the isolation scenario, is to build borders or walls or between the borders of the two countries. And as I said, we have no ecosystem other than Saudi Arabia. So no matter what walls there are, we will try to go through them. And also there is the moral isolation, that is to treat the Yemenis in a very harsh way, that's not to give them transit visas or work permits, etc. And if the GCC countries follow this scenario, they will put more pressure on the Yemenis. Another scenario of isolation is that there will be no more any interest in the politics of Yemen, and say, let's leave them alone. And this was happening now. It is sort of negligence of Saudis of the Yemeni issues, and that is why Iran benefits from that through the Houthis. And there is the blood scenario. That's to say, the GCC countries would try to create a strong central authority in Yemen. This is the key issue. This is the key solution for the integration of Yemen. It needs to be strengthened from the inside, and this requires a master plan, major projects, not only aid that is given every now and then, from which benefit only the political class, and which lead into more corruption, in fact, because most of that aid is made in a secret way, and that's why they can use it for their own purposes and steal it away. And has no benefits on the long run for the Yemenis. What Yemen needs is major projects, but to begin with, they need a good support to a central authority with a good popular and larger popular base. And also, as a summary of all what I said, I can say that Yemen will be a burden and will be a bottleneck for the GCC countries, especially for Saudi Arabia. The main danger for Yemen is, the danger coming from Yemen is more than danger coming from Iraq or Syria or elsewhere, because it's a real danger and should be treated soon if it is left for the future to be even more dangerous. That's why the best scenario for Yemen is the blood scenario. And this lot scenario also presupposes to send a message to all that separation is not a solution. No, it will increase the problems. And also federalism, which was adopted by Yemeni politicians, the stupid ones, lately, is also a project that will lead to chaos and not solutions. Yemen does not have a central authority government so that you can say that we need to decentralize it. No, what we need now is a central authority. What we need, what we are suffering from is the absence of such a central government or authority. So I think restructuring Yemen in any other way, the federalism or others, it will be only lead to more chaos and violence in Yemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Naser, for this paper on the options and prospective courses to be taken by the GCC towards Yemen. Second speaker is Dr. Abdulwahab al-Qassab, who will speak to us again on the challenges facing the GCC member states and potential choices and options towards the current Iraqi status quo or state of affairs following the American invasion and the rise of the Iranian intervention and the repercussions of the Arab Spring revolutions onto the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May God's peace and blessings be upon you. As a matter of fact, the title of the paper is Iraq and GCC, the current challenges, threats, and repercussions. So we will address current threats, challenges, and the consequences. At the outset, I would like to mention that the GCC region has been and will always remain the target of direct and indirect threats. These threats may be structural and others may be functional. Other structural, and by this I mean top among them is the geopolitical location of the GCC states. It is the key or the source of all problems, and it is the key to all answers. It is the source of problem. It has been always the same as it is. And it's the key to answers if we look at the integrative relations between that to be maintained between the GCC member states. And here I'm speaking of Iraq, the north neighbor, and the holder or the maintainer of the northern part of the GCC, speaking of geography. Also, the GCC countries, and that's why the problems are numerous throughout history. It is outstanding as it is the only marine passage in the human memory to be the first human marine lane. We have documents that the Sumerians, with their capital as Ur, at the Arabian Gulf used the marine course, indicating to certain Arab civilizations there, and al-Qatif and al-Ahsan, Saudi Arabia, Delmon, which is Oman, then Magan, that is also in Oman. From there, then the Sumerians moved and shifted. Delmon is Bahrain now, and Magan is Oman. From then, they moved off to the head of the fan, sub-Indian continent, and the Red Sea. This is documented in history. This also gave rise to a number of questions. How can the western coast of the Persian Gulf, that is mostly Arabs and always represented the artery of trade, while history does not record a very significant port on the eastern side or the northern one. When Jambarona, which is Bandar Abbas, emerged, it was recent, while I spoke about 6,000 years deep in history. A huge difference. As I said, the geopolitical location, critical, real, or geographical, has brought along a number of invaders to this region to benefit by the riches, whether in Or or Basra. It was the gateway to the shortest bridge connecting Europe and the East. This brought along a number of invaders, foreign invaders, who came to dominate, starting from China, early 15th century on Hormuz. They wished to create their own kingdom, but the empire backed down. Then the Portuguese, Dutch, French, English, and then the Americans. This represents one of the challenges created by the geopolitical location of the Arab Gulf countries. This will lead us to realize how the relations between the members throughout modern history, Iraq and the Gulf countries group that turned in 81 into the GCC member states, and the third is Iran. Iraq, GCC, Iran. Since 1958, it was ruled as a republic. Before 58, it was a monarchy, where the British wished to sever the relation between Iraq and the GCC. And we should not dig deep in history, at least between Iraq and Kuwait. Iraq, Bahrain, Iraq, and Kuwait has been in existence and well known. Here we have a syndrome or an equation. Iraq with its rule. On the other side is the GCC member states before and after the GCC, and the third is Iran. Before the formation of the GCC in 1969 with the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, we should have pillars strategy. The eastern coast, western Iran, and Saudi Arabia should enter into partnership. In 1972 in Iraq, went to enter into an agreement with the Russian Federation. So the Cold War syndrome moved into the Arab world. All these problems have been created as a result of this friction or the syndrome among the three states or the three religions around the Gulf. We then moved into the twin pillars when the Shah was removed and the Iranian Revolution came along. Also, the republic system of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. At that time, if not before, we have a strategic equilibrium with three parties. The north part is Iraq, eastern Iran, southern western is the GCC as a bloc that's created in 1981. Here, the Gulf countries missed a golden opportunity. At that time, they could have accommodated Iraq, and this was a proposal in the past. The Iraq could have been accommodated within the bloc, and there were a number of side agreements between Iraq and the GCC countries. Media, culture, education, except security coordination and political coordination. Here, they missed a golden opportunity. Had the opportunity been used, we wouldn't have faced the catastrophes that followed. This is the triangle with the three sides where each side have affected even after the Kuwait war and the siege led to Iraq, and even on the wake of the Iraqi invasion. A clear statistic was given that the military power of Iraq is enough to deter Iran and Iran's dominance. This continued to be valid until the 8th of May, after which this force is gone. We had only one. Iraq is gone, and we are left only with one state, that's Iran. And now I believe we are fully aware of what's going on. We can put a figure on the number of military maneuvers carried out by Iran, which is depending mainly on the non-symmetric approach, where the shark eats small fish. Iraq has lived in its modern entity. Some claim that Iraq was created in 1921. History has it documented that under the Ottoman Empire that held the reins since the 16th century, the three provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, were named the Iraqi plan, the three provinces. They were looked at as where Baghdad is the dominant. The entity that was created in following the World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there were four security concerns that have been having an effect. First is the absence of security of the eastern borderline of the country, simply for the reason that its eastern borderline was drawn in an arbitrary manner. There is not a single country in the world where the borderline is drawn over a mountainous terrain. That's why Iraq has never felt security from its eastern borderline. The second factor is the absence of an open marine port following the advancement and progress of the marine transportation system. It was sufficient in the past where the transportation were conventional in the 19th century. With the advent of new technologies, and Iraq was of the top producers and top oil reservists compared to other areas, Basra was not sufficient. One of the key factors that give rise to the continuous, constant friction with the friendly state, that's Kuwait. And the third one is the geographical location, Kurds, Arabs, etc. Iraq is a country of multiple ethnicities like many other states. However, these problems, or this particular problem, was politicized so that it was meant to divert Iraq from its endeavors. And I believe the eastern neighbor had played a role to the degree that Iraq has compromised and was forced to give up part of its eastern province to the Kurds. And the recent factor is the sectarianism. In the face of these four concerns, there are other external factors affecting the Iraqi national security from outside. Iran, one, I will not delve in. Two, Israel, and I will not either delve in because it's one of the reasons for the two things. Third is Turkey, and here it's different. Turkey, when the issue of the affiliation of Mosul province to Iraq under the United Nations, it was turned out of functional reasons, turned into an entity calling for the unity of Iraq and the domination of the centralization authority so that Turkey would protect their borderline. And the fourth factor is Iraq and the GCC as a bloc. I will conclude by raising the Iraqi concerns towards the GCC as a bloc, or to be the other way around, the GCC concerns towards Iraq. Concerns among the Gulf states can be encapsulated as follows. The first concern is the regime. The order or the regime of Iraq is a republic, which prevented Iraq from being accommodated within the bloc, the GCC bloc. The regime, the military coup, junta, instability will bring lots of problems, which we should do without. The second, and here we should step back a bit, is the liberalism of ideology among the Iraqi educated and the way they handle issues is in conflict with the traditional and conventional and cognitive mindset of the Gulf countries. That's why Iraq was sometimes branded as communism. Many of the Iraqis were Marxists. Or why would the GCC bring along the unwelcomed ideology into their environment? The third one is neutrality. And a few minutes ago, I always mentioned that Iraq has been siding to the Russian Federation during the Cold War, while the GCC bloc was siding with the other side. You're running out of time. And finally, the sectarian factor. I am the chairman, and I am to decide. I'm begging you not to be oppressive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You did a very good job, and I know your paper is very interesting and important, but I wish that you had got into the Gulf issue faster. 15 minutes is not enough for such a long paper, but we have the time factor. Now I give the floor to Mr. Maan, who will be speaking of what one can be called the escalating number of Gulf choices or options regarding the Syrian revolution and what has come. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank also the Arab Center for organizing this conference. In fact, my analytic paper is about the Gulf policies regarding Syria through two main axes and the recommendation. The first axis is the reasons of this Gulf position regarding Syria, which in addition to the obstacles of such a movement, and then I end the paper by recommendation. Before beginning, I would like to review two things, important facts that help us to understand the general political behavior in the Gulf. The first fact is that the Syrian revolution was not an event that's just another expansion of the Arab revolutions, but it is also a very complex issue that imposes the adoption of a number of very careful tools that take into consideration the role of the nature of the role of the Syrian regime in the region, and that they align also with the demands of the Syrian people. So the result of this behavior in general and the Gulf behavior was a behavior that was hesitant and calling for a sort of dialogue between the regime and the components of the opposition to protect the collapse of the Syrian state. At the same time, these protests were accompanied by a sort of chaotic behavior or situation in the international order, and some factors have come into the marge of the international order to fill the gap that is the result of the reluctance of USA regarding some priorities that are related to domestic affairs and or politics. That's why the Ankara, Tehran, and the GCC countries were encouraged to go into competition about the Syrian issue, each of which would like to prove their identity as a regional force. And these countries have tried to find a place for them in the regional hierarchy, whether going up or down according to how America has been isolated. The reasons of the Gulf movement. It is worth mentioning that the revolution in Syria was accompanied by what we called the Renaissance period of the Gulf, which witnessed a reviving of an active role of the GCC countries, and this includes the focusing on the center and on the periphery, especially after Iran's attempts to restrict and to put an end to any strategic cooperation between the GCC countries and to create a sort of position that pushed these countries into adopting a defensive policy. And in this case, Syria would be an achievement, strategic achievement for Iran, because it gives it way to Turkey and gives it a way to Lebanon and to Israel. And in addition to that, this geography of Syria is important and will stop the influence of Iraq. And Iran also has the advantage of encircling the Gulf states through the Sham territories, and with this gives it a better power of maneuver. In addition to that, if Syria joins the GCC groups, it will have a coalition that is almost the same of Iran. And the paper also says that the positions taken by the GCC countries was very much clear regarding the regime compared to other Arab governments during this peaceful protest. Right from the beginning, a lot of exits were suggested to get out of this crisis. But the continuation, and the reasons of that, the continuation of the refusal by the Syrian government and its continuation of using violence has pushed the Gulf countries to ask for the Syrian president to step aside and win the so-called Second Arab Initiative, and this was also to give moral support to the opposition. And this position was reached at summit when the GCC countries withdrew their ambassadors from Damascus and expelled the Syrian ambassadors from their countries. And then followed the Saudi Arabia and Qatar began helping the opposition and giving them logistic help, and then calling the international community to arm the Free Syrian Army and to recognize their institutions. At the same time, the Bahrain, Kuwait, and the Emirates have officially adopted the Arab League position, and they dealt with the situation in a different way. Sometimes they escalated, and sometimes went back to the diplomatic discourse. The effects of this interaction on the popular level was more clear in Kuwait and Bahrain, and was mostly better than the official position. As for Oman, its position has not been in line with the other GCC countries, because saying that this will internationalize the crisis. And I will give some reasons for the Gulf's interest in Syria, in Jarrah. The government The government of Syria is going in the same line as that of Iran, and they consider this as an international. They think that this is an international conspiracy paid by the Gulf to put on the ground an agenda that is Zionist and imperialist. This proves that the Iranian role in Syria is no longer a partner but a main factor or player. And in fact, we have a lot of statistics to prove that, whether on the popular level or the official level. But there are some issues, this issue about the security of that affect the security of the Gulf extensive Gulf states. For example, the overflow of refugees in the region, and that the differences in ethnic and religious differences. In addition to that, the fear that there's sort of instability that as a result of the violence, that this stability might expand and leak out to the region, especially now we're speaking about the period when the international coalition had not begun its airstrikes. So there was some transnational movements had to appear that are against all the regimes of the region, especially the GCC countries. Obama's administration was speaking only in favor of the societal issue in Syria, and it gave way to Iran to intervene because thanks to the Chinese and Russian support they got, and as a result of that, nationalists of the GCC countries had to take the initiative in defining what is the future of the Arab region and go into competition in this area. We will now speak about the obstacles in the way of any Gulf activity in the region, because the complication of the Syrian landscape has affected the movement of the Gulf states to support the Syrians compared to the period of the peaceful protest. One of these obstacles is threefold. The first one is international, the second is the Syrian issue itself, and third is related to the external relation politics itself. The nature and the behavior of the American player is one of the obstacles that stop the movement. America, after its experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, is reaching a political approach based on rationalizing the usage of its troops. And today we see that many indications that the Obama administration does not consider the Arab region except in a way to look for pressure cards that it can use in its nuclear negotiations with Iran. That's why Syria becomes a backward center for pressure, because Syria cannot be a threat to the security of the United States, that any intervention it makes will be only partial and will be only very limited. And of course there is the fluctuation of the American policies, and that's why some Gulf countries are reviewing their positions regarding the alliances with the USA. In addition to the nature of the behavior of the Russian player, who usually comes back to the scene because of the weakness of the international position regarding Syria, and it is making use also, of course, the crisis on the European countries, and that's why Russia has stopped any resolution in the Security Council against Syria, and going to give aid to the Syrians to mitigate their sufferings through supporting the regime, and at the same time not embarrassing the American position. And best example to that is the red line that was defined or announced about the chemical weapons. One of the obstacles were posed by Syrians themselves. For example, there are no ways of solution, and the Geneva conference failure, and all the other initiatives that cannot guarantee a real solution, which because they are managing the crisis, not solving it. And then there are the interventions trans-border, the Syrian arena witnesses a conflict between the regime and the people, and armed conflict between the opposition and some international forces, and then the conflict against the terrorism. That's why the national security of GCC countries is on the top priority of the movement. So the Gulf states' policies do not have a unified position and vision of the events, especially that of Syria, and this has been reflected on the political landscape of the opposition, who had been subjected to these differences by themselves. And also, the coalition, international coalition, wants only to fight the ISIL, not out for fighting the regime, and this is a real problem. And I said in the beginning that the political environment and the GCC country summit imposes to us to say that those who the recommendation is the common objectives is the solution to the crisis. One of the important aspects of this Syrian that it has brought out some different approaches to achieve the same goal, but that are different in their details about the alternative political regime and the kind of and the people and sources of support. That's why we should call for the success of the latest attempts to mitigate the internal differences and adopt a well-coordinated, unified position to make use of the common factors which are that will call back for unity. The opportunity and the challenge of facing or confronting the Iranian influence in the region. And Iran, which has a lot of pressure on Syria, and through Iraq, Bahrain, Eastern Saudi, and Yemen, and Syria. And this Syria, which is now under real military and political guardianship from Iran. So, losing a window to the Middle East means that its ambitions must be very much limited. Another factor that brings and helps to unify the ranks of the GCC countries is that, as a researcher, I find that I must clarify something, that the continuation of this conflict without trying to find solutions to it is the best or the strongest encouragement to the ISIL. The ISIL, although the Arab Center has organized a conference about ISIL, but being a researcher about Syria, I think it is important that it have a strategy to use these ambitions, which might be outside the human and religious values, building on a discourse that is mobilizing to say that we are fighting Safavis and Crusaders and to support Muslim Sunnis who are marginalized to develop their forces. Finally, I would say, give you the summary that the solution of the Syrian issue in a good way and supporting the new political order that protects what's left of the Syrian state must be the priority of the GCC countries, because that will be in the interest of the stability of their own countries and the Arab countries.
I give the floor to Dr. Baskan on the Turkish stand from the recent developments in Egypt. I leave the characterization or the description thereof to him, whether a revolution or a coup, and the impact on this interpretation about
Thank
the
you.
bilateral relations.
If you are following the Turkey's reaction to the military coup in Egypt, Erdogan appeared the spokesperson. If you are to describe his reaction to the military coup, you will see that it was emotionally charged, very personalized, and undiplomatic, and extremely harsh reaction. And I gathered together some statements of Erdogan regarding the military takeover in Egypt. First of all, Erdogan called it a coup in the sense, in the perfect sense of the word. He categorically condemned the coup, calling it all coups are evil. They target the people, they target the future, they target the democracy. And he often used very undiplomatic, very provocative language. In one case, for example, he even asked the Egyptian soldiers disobey the orders so that they are not going to shoot down the civilians. He criticized the West. He criticized the UN, and he criticized the Islamic world. And Islamic world, his analogy to the Islamic world was that the Islamic world, in the face of disaster in Egypt, this is his description, was like Joseph's brother who put the Joseph into pit. And finally, he was not very explicit, but he also criticized Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, even though he really didn't name it. And then he is asking them not to spend the money in the military government, but to share it with the rest of the poor Islamic countries. Very provocative languages. So Erdogan's reaction, I mean, very emotional, very personalized, very harsh reaction. Even Qatar, for example, Qatar in the second day sent a message of congratulations to the interim president, Abdul Naser. Turkey didn't do that. Turkey, even still, does not acknowledge the President Sisi. So Erdogan's reaction basically raises three questions that I am going to address briefly. I am interested as an academically on the first question. The second one is just to fit myself into this very well done conference. The first question is that why Erdogan reacted to military takeover so emotionally and so harshly? What was it that made him so harsh on the military coup? This is the question that I am sort of academically interested in. The second question is, how did his reaction, of course his reaction is Turkey's reaction, because Turkish foreign policy has become so personalized in the identity, in the person of the Erdogan. So how his reaction affected Turkey's relation with Saudi Arabia and then the UAE. The third question that I would like to address very briefly is that how does the future look like? Erdogan's reaction should be considered within the framework that UAE and Saudi Arabia have been the largest importers of Turkish goods and services in the Gulf, in the Arab world, even in the Islamic world. Together, they are, after Germany sometimes, after Russia in terms of the number, they are importing from Turkey billions of dollars. And the only country Turkey doesn't have any problem with in the GCC right now is Qatar. And imagine that UAE is importing from Turkey sometimes 10 times more than Qatar imports. So there is something going on here which is beyond the economic reasoning. If Erdogan was economically motivated, he would much more concerned about his relation with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which strongly supported the military coup in Egypt and then was against the Ikhwan in Egypt. So that apparently the economic reasoning is not at work here. So what is it then? A combination of factors played a role, in my opinion. And here the Erdogan's psychology, Erdogan's position in the domestic front, I believe, made a huge impact. If you remember, the coup happened in July 2013, 3rd of July. In the month preceding that military coup, for 1 month, Turkey witnessed massive street protests, which basically started in Istanbul and spread all across Turkey, bringing to the streets, according to the official estimate, 3.5 million people. And Erdogan was at home, was having this difficulty, which looked like very much the case in Egypt. There is also a popularly elected president there, Erdogan himself popularly elected. So he saw this as a kind of an international plot against himself and against the Islamists in the Middle East. And actually, some statement from the Muslim Brotherhood figures, for example, exactly point to this. The Gezi protests, the protests Erdogan are facing, we are not talking about the military coup. This statement is made in June. Is not targeting Erdogan really, it's targeting the Islamists. So here we have this paranoia, I mean, whether it's real or not, I'm not interested in that. But when the military coup happened in Egypt, Erdogan was already in that mindset there is something in the international level which is targeting me and targeting my audience. So it's a military coup. His reaction to the military coup was also his reaction to this broader international plot he was imagining. So here, I want to point out that it's not, I mean, psychology is important here. I mean, I should add to this, for example, the Turkish Islamists dashed hopes regarding that they are leading the Arab Spring, and Arab Spring is going to bring a new environment in which Turkey is going to be the major power, leading power, and we are going to rebuild the Ottoman sphere of influence. That's hope. Those hopes were dashed with the military coup. So there's also this kind of a psychological disappointment with the whole Arab Spring thing. But I want to point out to a deeper factor here, which is why we see across the Islamic world that the Islamists are sort of supporting each other when they face trouble at home. Here, I think that we should be aware of this transnational network of Islamists, which is spanning all the way from United States to Turkey, to Middle East, to Arab world, and all the way to the Far East Asia. So this network is not hierarchical, nor very much monolithic, but still the linkages, the personal linkages, the institutional linkages are so strong and it has been going on for decades right now. And I claim that this linkages network created this same socio-political imaginary. The Islamists across the globe see themselves and then the global systems in the same way, themselves in the same way. So when they see something happening outside, they respond as if it is happening to them. Or if I use a kind of an Ibn Khaldunian term, the Islamists have their own asabiya. The asabiya that keeps them internally consolidated and conscious of what's happening. So Erdogan's reaction should be read as a kind of a reflection of this asabiya, Islamist asabiya to the event. Let me tell you this. I mean, the story of this, how global network came into being, is beyond the scope of this speech, of course. It's very historical. It's very difficult to trace the whole map. And I am now working on a book, and if those of you are interested in, I might inform you when I am done with that. But again, this network, without taking this network into account, we cannot really make sense of why the brothers in Egypt were supporting Erdogan during the Gezi protests, and why Erdogan reacted to military coup in Egypt so harshly, so emotionally. Because Erdogan had to give the message to his own constituency, which is religious community in Turkey, which is the hardcore supporter of Erdogan right now, who are, again, embedded into that global Islamist network, I believe. So without taking this into account, I believe we cannot really understand, explain Erdogan's harsh reaction to the military coup in Egypt. So Erdogan's reaction was sending this signal to the Islamists in Turkey was that I am one of you, and then so that you have to you can stand behind me if there is any domestic opposition, of course. The second question is how Turkey's relations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates affected. There was, of course, you remember maybe that the Turkey's relations with Egypt totally collapsed diplomatically. Both of them expelled their ambassadors, and they rarely talked to each other. But with the Gulf, a similar development did not happen. They didn't, the diplomatic relations are still on, and then they didn't collapse. But the thing is that there was an expectation that this is going to affect the relations between Turkey and the UAE, and then and early on, actually, in August, Abu Dhabi, for example, decided to delay $12 billion investment in Turkey. So there was this kind of a punishment from the Gulf. But that punishment did not really materialize into a big change, because if you look at this is the foreign direct investment in Turkey from the GCC countries in respect to the blue line is the GCC. Basically, there is not much change in terms of the foreign direct investment from the Gulf happening in Turkey. It is, the level is as it used to be in the past. In terms of Turkey's export to the GCC countries, again, they are at the same level before the military coup. Apparently, economically speaking, financially speaking, the Turkish reaction or Erdogan's reaction did not really cause a big trouble. But Turkey paid other prices. Like, for example, there are reports, of course, these are not official reports, but I have heard this from friends in Ankara, that there are long absences of ambassadors from the UAE and Saudi Arabia in Ankara. They go to their country, they don't come back. Diplomatic relations are not cut down, but definitely there is a cooling down of the relationship. Also, the fifth Turkey GCC high-level strategic dialogue, which was held in Istanbul in 2012, the fifth one was about to be held in Bahrain, but it never happen again. So this is the last time, 2012, and we don't have this meeting again. And this is possibly because of the cooling down of the relations between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Of course, it was decided that it will be held in Bahrain, and I should remind you that this meeting started when GCC declared that Turkey is a strategic partner. So I want to go on. So there are some sort of prices Turkey paid, and one of them is, of course, the Turkey loss in its United Nations Security Council bid. There is it's not open secret that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt, of course, campaigned against Turkey in the United Nations, and Turkey did abysmally in the vote. The third question that I want to address is that what about the future? And I have just 1 minute to comment on that. I guess Turkey is still important for the GCC. I mean, I don't expect a deterioration, but also I don't expect a betterment in the relations or improvement in the relations. In 2010, for example, Erdogan was awarded the International Prize for Service to Islam. I don't think that those days will come back. Because I guess what happened is that the Arab GCC countries have seen right now that the Islamists of Turkey are anti-systemic and anti-status quo as much as the Ikhwan is. Why Ikhwan is a threat to Saudi Arabia, UAE? The Turkish Islamists are likewise, because they share the same socio-political imaginary, which I guess is disturbing to the GCC states. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. قبل ما ننتقل إلى قسم المناقشة، لدينا ضيف كان مفترض أن يكون ضمن متحدثين الجلسة، لكن الظروف لم تسمح بهذا. وهو الدكتور برهان غليون رئيس المجلس الوطني السوري السابق وأحد الوجوه المعروفة في المعارضة السورية، وتم الاتفاق.
Yes, we will give Dr. Burhan 5 minutes to speak, and I hope he would observe the 5-minute time limit. Burhan Ghalioun of the Syrian opposition. I am keen on observing the time limit. I'm keen on speaking. However, I believe it is very beneficial to seize this opportunity to raise the questions we used to run away from about the future options for the region, not each and every problem or state. And this is the very important issue that I wish to highlight. And this in the following points. First is where conflicts in Syria and Iraq and other countries, that the Fertile Crescent, Syria, Lebanon, are not bonded through temporary interest. They are deep-rooted in history, traditions, culture, and this bond has never been broken at any point of time, or even with the advent of the modern age where the Arab states wished to steer away from imperialism. The Arab revolutions started by alliances from the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant by 1916 revolution. And here I would like to stress that this bond is deep-rooted in history. It will always remain, and this what gave the identity, the Arabian identity of the Fertile Crescent, and this what causes the Gulf countries to support revolutions in the Arab Spring countries, namely in Syria, especially if FAO are stated that they are running out of resources. We turn first to the Gulf countries simply because they believe we are their fellow brothers. Second, the war in Syria today, it is not a completely Syrian war. It is a regional war, a proxy war by well-trained, well-financed, well-equipped militias, supported, backed, financed, and trained by Tehran. It is a regional war, and here I say it is not the battle of Syria. It is the battle to manipulate and dominate the Arab landscape. In the face of this regional war, we should not provide limited domestic solutions. The East should be, the Middle East is seen as to be the first line of defense for Tehran, or the in-depth back defense of the Arabian Peninsula. The third point I wish to raise briefly, the pressure exercised today by Iran mainly, and if not by other players, will not be limited in terms of force or in time. I believe it will be a long-term pressure. First is the absence of equilibrium, structural balance in the Middle East. While Tehran, over 10 years of siege, were invested in developing their military infrastructure, then infiltrate their own militias into the Arab world. Our Middle East today is an area of true vacuum, an all open area, wide open before any force willing to penetrate. The reason for this vacuum is the withdrawal of the Western powers, namely the United States, from defending this region. Two big reasons should make us feel, or at least be aware, that the pressures will exacerbate in future and there will be no changes unless we ourselves take real action to defend ourselves. And here we raise the questions of options. What are the options we have in future in order to fill this vacuum, which is a call, an open call for other foreign forces, including Iran, to penetrate? Whether the Fertile Crescent will be an area of pressure onto the countries, including the GCC, or the other way around, where we need more brave actions in order, which is to reinvigorate the true partnership with the Fertile Crescent countries, not by words but by action. The Fertile Crescent should be the true shield, the true defensive shield by people, by resource. And the Arabian Peninsula now has the potential, has the resources, technical, technological, and financial, in order to reinforce this form of partnership, in order to reshape and rebuild the Arab world. I believe this is very significant. The last point, today, the battle in Syria, or the war in Syria, is the battle of the whole Middle East. The Gulf countries were the first to propose a diplomatic initiative for the solution into Syria, then backed down and handed over the file to other countries, and that's why it is deteriorating. The Gulf countries is duty-bound to reshoulder the responsibility at two levels. First, a diplomatic proposed initiative to bring the Syrians militarily, politically, and diplomatically, and at one front. The second one is directed towards the international community in order to have the Security Council resolution towards Syria implemented, enforced, and have all the foreign militias forced out of Syria. I believe this is the duty of the GCC countries, and I'm certain that they are capable of handing down the due necessary resolutions in order to restore Syria and rebuild the entire area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rashid, you have 2 minutes, Dr. Anwar. I thank the panelists for their presentations, and I say to Mr. Abdul Naser, who whenever he was talking about Saudi Arabia, he pointed to me as if I am Saudi Arabia. The other thing is that Saudi Arabia will not abandon Yemen, never, because Yemen and Saudi Arabia are one and the same. And as for the other gentlemen, I already said that if Iran does not stop what it's doing, and if Iraq does not stop isolating others, and if Syria does not stop fighting, the coming solution will be the greater Kurdistan. Dr. Ammar Hassan. Dr. Burhan will not be upset with what I say, but the GCC countries are part of the problem in Syria. The mistake was right from the beginning was freezing the membership of Syria in the Arab League. The second thing is that the unacceptable condition imposed by the opposition could not be fulfilled, accepted. Right from the beginning, we don't want to speak about the president. The president, they said, we were toppling of the regime. This is not Tunisia, this is not Egypt, because there was a unanimity of opinion. But in Syria, there were other forces that refused such a change. And that's why the Syrian opposition has put Syria in this present position, because it refused right from the beginning to be part of the solution, because it refused to refuse the solution. And in fact, I don't think the GCC countries can intervene because they are even in different positions regarding how to intervene in Syria. That's why the Syrian people are suffering. It is you who can, as a opposition, you can solve your problems without the help of anybody. The GCC countries have their own problems, the Arabs have their own problems, and the opposition must make concessions just like the regime. You cannot put an end to the regime because it's attached or has bonds with Syria, with Russia, Iran, with China, so you need to review your position, really. Dr. Zaid. And I also thank all the panelists. Since we began these sessions, everybody is speaking about Iran and the intervention of Iran and the Iranian influence. So we are facing one of two things. Either Iran is very strong and very large, or we only put the blame on Iran only. And I agree with what Dr. Burhan, that in some regions we left a lot of vacuum, and Iran or other countries came to fill this vacuum. That's why this is the introduction to speak about Yemen. No doubt Yemen requires something from the GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, to cooperate with Yemen, because the Gulf has always the Gulf should be an umbrella for all, and Yemen is the Arab extension of the Gulf. That's why I think that we must have a new Gulf vision to revive the life culturally, politically in Yemen. And the other thing, I agree with Mr. Abdul Naser that federalism is another factor that led to the collapse of Yemen. Federalism, that the 6 regions in Yemen will become 60. And finally, Yemen did know a central government in the past, whether during al-Mutawakkil Allah Ismail or Yahya Hamduddin, or even during the Rasuli state or the other states that were in Yemen, not only 1990 government or state. Thank you. Mr. Abdul Naser. Thank you. I thank all the panelists. There is something in common, at least in the approach to the problems of Yemen as a failed state, and Iraq, which is so far not a successful country, and Syria, which is in a civil war, regional civil war. Everybody is focusing on the GCC countries to intervene and for integration with Yemen or Iraq or in the GCC Council and more action in Syria, because there is another force, which is Iran or Russia or others, that is intervening. So you also must intervene just like them. This is not an objective approach. One should look for this integration for common objectives and interests, and the Yemeni elite must solve its own problems. And it was said Yemen was successful. It was to be called the Yemen Sa'id, the happy Yemen, and Iraq used to be called the fertile land. But it's only the selfishness of the elite that brought things to this situation. As for Syria, the GCC countries should play a role, but not as was suggested by Burhan Ghalion, and put the blame on the West and now say, why has the West given up? He is asking for Atlantic NATO role, as it was the case in Libya. No, what's required is to be realistic in dealing with the situation in Syria, and all the countries, regional and international, should reach a compromise or negotiated solution, just as Europe did about about Yugoslavia. Muhammad Gharib. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I am in a scientific session. I benefit very much. I am an Egyptian lawyer. I'm sad for one thing. Scientific research should lead to outcomes, and these outcomes should not necessarily be pleasing to the regimes and governments. I think our problem in the Arab world and in the GCC countries is that you have two things that are conflicting inside us: the needs of the regimes and the needs of the peoples. We are now living the stage of peoples, not regimes. And for the changes, we have also two conflicting things. Are you with peaceful constitutional changes, or are we calling for keeping the region as it is on the text of political stability? The gentleman from Turkey, the researcher from Turkey, Dr. Baskan, thinks that Erdogan had taken an emotional position. This is not true. Heads of state don't take emotional positions. Their personal feelings are for them. When he speaks on behalf of state. Erdogan, the popularity does not mean anything. The people have elected him in the elections. And the state is not measured by its size. Qatar on the map is a small country, but it is big. India is one of the biggest countries in the world, but has no voice in the international arena. So the important thing is not the size. Egypt is the mother of all civilizations, but in these 60 years has no voice at all. So it is the relation between peoples and regimes. Dr. Antoine Haddad. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Dr. Burhan in his analysis of by saying that the regional aspect has overcome the domestic one in Syria. One no longer speaks of a revolution for freedom, and this maybe is partially because of the weakness of the Arab position and the differences between the Arabs, and especially the differences between Turkey and the Arabs, given how important is the role of Turkey. This vacuum that was filled by Iran, I am against the Iranian role in Syria and against what it's doing by using Lebanese and Iraqi tools. This, of course, will be catastrophic results on Lebanon. The situation in Syria, in my opinion, has now needs a better understanding more than needing tripartite understanding or Iranian, Turkish, Arabic. It's not enough, it's no longer, at least now, enough to encourage Arab people and speak of emotional words or to find an Arab-Turkish background. No, the investments in the Iranian role inside this war now requires a tripartite understanding, and I'm saying that with a realistic point of view, and has nothing to do with what I love, what I want. Hamid al-Bahtani. I thank all the panelists. My question is to Dr. Abdul Naser al-Muwadea. In an objective way, what is the real addition that Yemen can give to the GCC countries at the present time if we just exclude the demographic one? Mohammed Saad Muqaddam. Thank you. I have a small remark with Dr. Abdul Naser. When he spoke, when he said that Yemen could be a real risk or danger, and he put a scenario, said the best scenario is that Yemen requires a central authority. You know that there was a national dialogue for all the political parties who reached, with the blessing of the GCC countries, to the solution called the federal system. Why are you worried about this federal system in Yemen, while as we see it's successful in the Emirates? And you know that the issue of the South wants to separate from the North. So maybe the federal system will be the only solution with the GCC countries' support, and we know that they do support this initiative. Now we go back to the panelists. Each of them has 3 minutes to answer. And we'll go back to Dr. Burhan because there were 2 remarks made about his intervention. We begin, Mr. Baskan.
I'm not going to use 3 minutes because there was just one comment about my talk, so I will just use 1 minute. I guess Turkey people voted for Erdogan. Whatever the reason they are voting for him, we should respect that. But the fact that people voted for him does not unmake his reaction emotional and undiplomatic and harsh. I guess if you read his speeches about military coup in Egypt, they are full of emotion, they are full of personal remarks, and as if in his imagination he and Turkey is the same, which is, I believe, a very dangerous imagination. But people voted for him, and we should respect that.
I thank all the people who commented, and I agree with some of them and disagree with the others. Dr. said that the solution might be the Greater Kurdistan. This reminds me of the number of solutions and maps that are being published in foreign think tanks, which are terrifying people and saying as if we are facing divisions of the countries. Are these solutions that are based on realistic things? But they neglect other aspects. For example, the latest plan was Demistro's plan, which is based on about some truces between the conflicting parties. This plan also doesn't take into consideration the societal aspect. In fact, this paper is a research paper that studies the societal aspect outside the regime, outside the opposition. Today, the societal issue is 4 years old, and the question is, where were the Arab world through the Arab League towards the society in Syria? And there are some unaccepted or unconditional conditions. The plan has 5 plans, but they did not achieve the ceiling of the demands of the opposition, and the regime rejected all of them. This paper was to research the situation that is imposed by the geography, the nature of the common threats, and it's not begging for help. In addition to that, in fact, there are some things in the opposition that need to be reviewed because there are some mistakes that were made, but there's also some regional, international differences about Syria. We are speaking about more than 1,500 different military factions in Syria. We are talking about militias of Hezbollah, militias of Iraq. So we must, the political realpolitik must be taken into consideration. We must look and keep in mind the catastrophic roles of other parties, and that's why we need to review all the situation.
I would like to complete my presentation, which I missed. When we speak about the concerns among the GCC member states, we, in consideration of the relations with Iraq, Iraq is part and parcel of the geopolitical system than the security equation of the GCC, as we mentioned, the triangle one. However, there is another geopolitical enterprise designed and led by Iran, as it wishes to also starting from premier on the Chinese border to Iraq, to Iran, then Levant, Syria, in order to reach the Mediterranean. We have two geopolitical systems involving Iraq and Iran and north of Syria. Those both systems are pressuring the GCC bloc. The solution, briefly, is that the GCC member states should reconsider the relations to the present potentials of power and to utilize them in order to convince the regional and global players of their ability. At that point, we will reach that conclusion that this bi-directional pressure by the geopolitical system led by Iran will be relieved and will be stripped of one of the major components. This will encourage both the Iraqi people and the Syrian people to decide their future. And I believe that the Middle East is the extended Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, in addition to the Arab states, will have an impact and a big say on the international global relations. Dr. Zaid mentioned that when centralized states are present, yes, it's true, it is, but yet not within this geographical borders. Some of them is represented outside, and this is what I wish to explain. Another speaker said what the Yemen add to the GCC. When countries establish relations, there are two factors: either to prevent harm or to bring benefit. At this point of time, it's important for the Gulf countries to prevent harm, which has more precedency over bringing benefit. I'll give you brief figures. The population of Yemen is doubling in every 20 years. It will be 100 million people. After 100 years, it will reach 1 billion. The Yemeni people will reach 1 billion. You can imagine how can you deal with them. That's why it is the Gulf countries, the Gulf state members, is duty bound to fend off this harm, as the scenario of isolation leads to the scenario of all-out penetration. That's why it is to the best interest of the Gulf state member states to prevent the deteriorating, exacerbating situation in Yemen, to fend off harm. Some spoke about the federal and the dialogue. The dialogue conference is a total lie. There was no dialogue. There was only a discourse between Omar and President Hadi to impose the issue of federalism. It was a total lie promoted by Omar in consultation with the foreign embassies. And this is the total outcome of the dialogue conference. There was no dialogue. The outcome is merely paper or ink on paper. Yemen is moving in another direction away from the outcomes of the dialogue conference. Now we give the floor to Burhan. Dr. Burhan. I will go one point by another. Evaluating the performance of the GCC member states who intervened in the Syrian affair, we have many reservations in terms of the entire performance, coordination, organization. Yet it is very difficult to move from this point to another point, which is the Gulf was part of the problem. This is the mindset of the Syrian regime. Without the support extended by the GCC states to some radicals or Islamists, there would have been no revolution. The first statement made by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, almost supporting the revolution, was 5 months from the spark of the revolution. It had nothing, it made no mention of toppling the regime, just mentioning reforms. The millions of Syrians who took to the street were demanding reforms. Yet the systematic organized killing at the hands of the regime led the people to demand for the toppling the regime. This raises another question. Were the opposition realistic in their negotiations? Not in a single minute did the opposition stop about negotiating the solution, headed to Geneva. It was the regime that were in total refusal. They had the military upper hand. The revolutionary fighters of Syria have no interest in deciding the battle militarily. It is the regime, simply for the reason that the regime claims that we are terrorists. And if those who are blaming us or placing the burden on the regime, on the opposition, let them question, is the regime willing to engage in genuine negotiations? We have been living in total sterility, political barren. Not more than 3 people were allowed to gather. The regime has been lying, and the opposition does not have the media machine of the regime. The foreign interventions, some claim that we raised the stakes on the NATO and foreign forces. If any intervention is made, it is to the interest of the regime. Today, by mid-2012, the regime was almost toppled. And a statement made by Hassan Nasrallah, hadn't Hezbollah intervened in Syria, the regime would have been toppled. The revolutionary fighters were 1.5 kilometers from the presidential palace. Hence, Hezbollah intervened. More than 50,000 qualified, trained militias led by Iranian officers. Where is the opposite intervention? We are being accused of calling for intervention, not the dialogue, while it was the regime who brought in the foreign intervention, unless we consider Iran is not a foreign intervention, and have acquired the right to defend the regime. It is not, we cannot bring about genuine results unless we believe that it was the regime who brought in intervention. Our last point about Yemen, but yet it relates to Syria. Some asked, would Yemen add if it joined the bloc? The answer is it will not add nothing, but it will cost. However, if it is not included, the consequences and repercussions of its crisis will have a deep impact on the Gulf. As said earlier, it is important to fend off harm more than bringing benefit. The GCC bloc will pay a high price if it continues to settle in this quagmire. More than 10 million refugees, homeless, displaced Syrians. Half of the children have dropped out of schools. Who is to blame? Some of them will become radicals like those from the refugee camps of the Palestinians. They have to vent off their disappointment. We should have a wide horizon of joint action to salvage the entire area, and the Gulf has the potentials to salvage the area. Raise proposals to those wasted people to take the lead, to fend off the harm, and defend themselves. Otherwise, we will plunge into an all-out, constant, ongoing war. One minute. To the management of the conference would like to address the audience. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the end of this proceedings, the proceedings of the conference, we extend all appreciation to those who have contributed to the success of the conference, whether through their presentation papers or any form of contribution, and also the participation. I believe the evaluation is at your hands. At the end of the day, we have achieved a large portion of our objectives by bringing at one front those elite thinkers and intellectuals from Arab and non-Arab and Gulf and non-Gulf states to put to discussion some of the major issues that are of concern to our respective countries. I have been present at many discussions that were very rich, not only within the chambers, yet in the out corridors. I was very pleased to hear that joint research efforts will be combined by some fellow brothers from the GCC member states, and I'm one of them. We know, and I have read it in an English literature, not the Arabic, and as the others have the right to discuss our affairs, I believe that we still have much, or not doing enough, to analyze ourselves and to project the right image, simply for the reason that those who write literature on us come from different backgrounds and they have their own reasons and purposes to put us under study. Another issue I would like to every one of you, we are very much pleased to have reached this point, convened this conference, and your participation. I would like to state that the doors of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies is wide open to all of you, whether in terms of the publication of the researches and presentations relating to the Gulf countries. It is the responsibility we shoulder to present more studies on our affairs, our concerns, and also ambitions. I hope that these discussions that took place behind these walls to be more resounding when the Gulf Summit is convened. Once again, I extend all thanks and appreciation. Thank you, Mr. Khalid, Dr. Khalid, for allowing me to address the audience. We thank all the organizers, all the audience, your participation, and we wish to see you again in the near future. Thank you very much, and goodbye.